Okay, open your book Bibles to Daniel 1 and verse 5. That's where we left off before I went on vacation. And Mike, or David Miller, will you read Daniel 1 verse 5 for us?
At the same hour, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the fascia of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote.
That's not what I've got.
No, me neither.
That's not what I've got from Daniel.
Oh, excuse me.
No, I didn't say it.
1-5. It is 5-1.
Oh, 5-1, okay.
Okay, never mind. Restart. Okay. Here we go. This is right. And the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king.
That's better. In verse 5, the term for the king's meat used here is a technical Persian term that is used only twice in the Old Testament and both times in the book of Daniel. It denotes gifts from the royal table. The king's food would have helped reverse the effects of the siege and the deportation. However, there seems to have been a more devious reason behind the king's generosity. Remember, the king's goal was to brainwash these children. He wanted them to forget their own land and the culture and become Chaldeans. His theme song may have been, "How are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris?" Well, did it work? Out of all the captives, only 4 that we know of remained true to God. Only 3 were cast in the fiery furnace. We will discuss later why Daniel was not among them. Our message: the devil constantly works to change our appetites. He wants us to crave the things of this world. We need to resist the way that Daniel did. I got 3 scriptures here. We're going to read all 3 of them. Will somebody get Romans 2 or Romans 12 verse 2? And someone get 1 John 2:15 and 16? And someone get 2 Corinthians 6 and 17?
I've got Romans 12:2.
Okay.
And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God.
Okay. Someone have 1 John 2:15, 16?
Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, and the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but of the world.
And 2 Corinthians 6:17.
Therefore come out from among them, and be separate, says the Lord. Do not touch what is unclean, and I will receive you.
Okay. Our greatest danger is that we will be absorbed by the world, by an alien, hostile, pagan culture. Note, typically these feasts would have begun with a sacrifice to the false Babylonian gods and would have consisted of many unclean foods. When we study 1 Corinthians 8, we will see that this problem continued into the New Testament times. Someone turn to 1 Corinthians 8 and read verse 4, please.
Therefore, concerning the eating of things offered to idols, we know that an idol is nothing in the world, and that there is no other God but one.
Okay? Thus Daniel and his friends had a dilemma. Would they compromise or not? But shouldn't they have eaten the food? After all, as verse 5 says, they were going to have to stand before the king. Yes, but Daniel answered to another king, a higher king. There was another king that Daniel would stand before someday, which is God. Problem. They were educated for 3 years and then went before the king. Yet later in chapter 2, we discover that Nebuchadnezzar's first dream occurred during the 2nd year of his reign. Is this a contradiction? No. It is possible that their education did not take a full 3 years. Someone read Mark 8:31, please.
And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again.
That verse says that Jesus would rise after 3 days, when in fact he rose on the 3rd day. In Genesis 42:17 and 18, we find that Joseph put his brothers in jail for 3 days, but we later see that he brought them out during the 3rd day. A second explanation involves the Babylonian system for dating the years of a king's reign that we discussed earlier. The actual first year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign was called the year of his ascension. The actual 2nd year of his reign was called the first year of his reign, and etc. The first year of their training would have corresponded to Nebuchadnezzar's year of ascension. Another possibility is that they were still in school. This will explain why they were not present when the king first spoke to the wise men. Now to Daniel 1:6 and verse 7. Harvey, would you read that, please?
Which one is it?
Daniel 1:6 and 7.
Daniel 1, 6 and 7.
Mhm.
Now from among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. To them, to chief of the eunuchs, gave names. He gave Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hanan, Shadrach, to Mishael, and to Azariah, Abednego. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chiefs of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself.
Okay. Paul's right there. Any questions, comments up to this point? Hardy.
I thought we were reading about Daniel being a eunuch. Didn't it say he's a eunuch here? Were Daniel, among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. To them the chief of the eunuchs gave names.
The chief of the eunuch give names. Any other?
Yeah, but if he's the chief of the eunuchs, is he in charge of these guys? That's what I'm asking that question.
I think we'll find out later.
Okay, I just want to.
And yeah, I've studied ahead a little bit. And I think we're going to find that out later.
All right, because I was reading your notes for the last one we were last year. I was like, they're not sure. You know, some of the commentators, are not sure.
Yeah, commentators sometimes
I know, you're right.
are split, but yeah, you're right. Any other comments?
There's no indication that
No,
None at all.
I don't think so.
Nope.
But I didn't see any. Okay. At last we are introduced to the hero of our story, Daniel, and his 3 friends. Would anyone in the world have considered young teenage Daniel to be an important figure at this time? No, but to God he was the utmost importance. We must try to see the world as God sees it. Their Hebrew names were all changed to Chaldean names so that they would forget their land and culture. At this time, your name was an integral part of your identity, much more so than today. Very often, as we see here, your name contained the name of your God. This is not only the time a name change such as this occurred in the Bible. Joseph became Zephaniah Peni in Genesis 41:45. Someone read Genesis 41:45 for us, please. Okay? And Edessa became Esther in Esther 2:7. Someone read Esther 2:7, please.
And he brought up Hasiah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter.
And as others we read about in the Bible, the name was changed. Saul was changed to Paul, and a few others. Here, Daniel, God is my judge, becomes Belshazzar. Nebo, protect my life or protect the king. The meaning of Daniel's name is hinted at in Daniel 4, verse 8. Someone turn to Daniel 4 and we'll read verse 8. When Nebuchadnezzar said that Daniel was named after his god, which presumably Nebo, another commentary said that Belshazzar may refer to Belit, the wife of Marduk, which is another god. There are several theories regarding the meaning of the other names. The ones given here seem to be the most popular. Hananiah, Yahweh has shown grace, becomes Shadrach, the command of Aku, which honors the Sumerian moon god. Aku. Mishael, who is what God is, became Mashach, who is what Aku is. Azariah, Yahoo has helped, become Abednego, the servant of Nego, probably in reference to Nebo. Here's a good question. Why do we remember Daniel by his Hebrew name and the others by their Babylonian names? Anybody know that question? Sure. Sure, anybody else? B1, Daniel wrote the book, and he seems to favor his original name. Also, it is easier to pronounce than Belshazzar. I wonder if he had used his new name, whether Belshazzar would now be a popular name like Daniel is. Something to think about. Also, when the book was written during the Persian rule, the earlier king Belshazzar was a grace figure, which is very close to Daniel's new name, Belshazzar. As for Daniel's three friends, he sometimes uses their old names and sometimes uses their new names. Their new names seem to have stuck, though, because those are the ones that are used during the fiery furnace account. Again, the pronunciation theory may apply here as well. Note also that after the exile, some Jews still use Babylonian names. Zerubbabel means the seat of Babylon, and Shenazar refers to a Babylonian moon god. We use the days of the week that refer to false gods. Whatever the reason, the Babylonians changed the name of the Jewish kings, and they changed the names of Daniel's friends, but they did not change Daniel's name. Any comments, questions up to this point? You have a question, speak up. Daniel 1:8. John, will you read Daniel 1:8 for me, please?
But Daniel proposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacy, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore, he requested the chief eunuchs that he might not defile himself.
Okay, Nebuchadnezzar's brainwashing plan had three components. Teach them Chaldean culture and languages, give them Chaldean names, and feed them Chaldeans food. The first two could be done without compromising the Word of God. Daniel could learn their culture without having to adopt it and believe in their false gods. We should never run from knowledge. Would Daniel have had such an impact on Babylon if he had buried his head in the sand and refused to learn about them? We need to teach our children to be discerning, not to run in fear from knowledge. Remember, Daniel's friends spent 3 years being taught the culture. Also, the Babylonians could call them anything they wanted. But the heathen food was another matter. This is where our teenage hero and his friends had to draw the line. These teenage boys drew the line at food. Why? Jewish food had to be prepared properly, blood drained, etc. Also, many animals were considered unclean and could not be eaten. The Babylonians ate pork and horse, which violated the dietary laws in the Torah. Turn to Leviticus 11. Somebody start reading in verse 1 if you would, please.
Yahweh spoke again to Moses and to Aaron, saying to them, Speak to the sons of Israel, saying, These are the creatures which you may eat from, all the animals that are on the earth, whatever divides a hoof, thus making split hooves, and chews the cud among the animals that you may eat. Nevertheless, you shall not eat of these among those which chew the cud, or among those which divide the hoof. The camel, for though it chews the cud, it does not divide the hoof. It is unclean to you. Likewise, the shaken, for though it chews cud, it does not divide the hoof. It is unclean to you. The rabbit also, for though it chews the cud, it does not divide the hoof. It is unclean to you. And the pig, for though it divides the hoof, thus making a eat of their flesh, and you shall not touch their carcasses, they are unclean. These you may eat, whatever is in the water, all that have fins and scales, those in the water and the seas or in the rivers you may eat. For whatever is in the seas and in the rivers that does not have fins and scales among all the swarming life of the water, and among all the living creatures that are in the water, they are detestable things to you. And they shall be detestable to you. You may not eat of their flesh, and their carcasses you shall detest. Whatever in the water does not have fins and scales, it is detestable to you. These moreover you shall detest among the birds. You shall not be eaten. They shall not be eaten. They are detestable: the eagle and the vulture and the buzzard, and the kite and the falcon and its kind, every raven in its kind, and the ostrich and the owl and the gull and the hawk in its kind, and the little owl and the cormorant and the great owl and the white owl and the pelican and the carrion vulture and the stork, the heron in its kind, and the hoopoe and the bat, all the swarming things that fly and walk on all fours are detestable to you. Yet these you may eat among all the swarming things that fly and walk on all fours, those which have above their feet jointed legs with which to jump on the earth. These of them you may eat: the locust in its kind, and the devastating locust in its kind, and the cricket in its kind, and the grasshopper in its kind. But all other swarming things that fly and that are four-footed are detestable to you. By these moreover you will be made unclean. Whoever touches their carcasses become unclean until evening, and whoever picks up any of their carcasses shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. Concerning all the animals which divide the hoof, but do not make a split hoof, or which do not chew cud, they are unclean to you. Whoever touches them becomes unclean. Also whatever walks on its paws, among all the creatures that walk on all fours, are unclean to you. Whoever touches their carcasses becomes unclean until evening, and the one who picks up their carcasses shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. They are unclean to you. Now these are to you the unclean among the swarming things which swarm on the earth: the mole, the mouse, the great lizard and its kind, the gecko and the crocodile and the lizard and the sand reptile and the chameleon. These are to you the unclean among all the swarming things. Whoever touches them when they are dead becomes unclean until evening. Also anything on which one of them may fall when they are dead and become unclean, including any wooden article or clothing or skin or sack, any article by which work is done, it shall be put in the water and be unclean until evening, when it becomes clean. As for any earthenware vessel into which one of them may fall, whatever is in it becomes unclean, and ye shall break the vessel. Any of the food which may be eaten, or which water comes, shall become unclean, and any liquid which may be drunk in every vessel shall become unclean. Everything moreover on which part of the carcass may fall becomes unclean. An oven or a stove shall be smashed. They are unclean and shall continue as unclean to you. Nevertheless, a spring or a cistern collecting water shall be clean, though the one who touches their carcasses shall be unclean. And if a part of their carcass falls on any seed or sowing which is to be sown, it is clean. Though if water is put on the seed, and a part of their carcass falls on it, it is unclean to you. Also, if one of the animals dies which you have for food, the one who touches his carcass becomes unclean until evening. He too who eats some of his carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean until the evening, and the one who picks up his carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. Now every swarming thing that swarms on the earth is detestable; it shall not be eaten. Whatever goes on its belly, and whatever goes on all fours, whatever has many feet, in respect to every swarming thing that swarms on the earth, you shall not eat them, for they are detestable. Do not render yourself detestable through any of the swarming things that swarm. You shall not make yourself unclean with them, to that you become unclean. For I am Yahweh your God. Therefore set yourself apart as holy, and be holy, for I am holy. you up from the land of Egypt to be your God. Thus you shall be holy, for I am holy. This is the law regarding the animals and the birds and every living thing that moves in the waters and everything that swarms on the earth, to separate between the unclean and the clean, between the edible creature and the creature which is not to be eaten.
Thank you for reading that for us. Long reading, but I think we get a picture of what they could and could not eat. And Leviticus and Deuteronomy says about the same thing. Now, the question is, that's an extensive list of animals or food we couldn't eat back then. How many on the list do we eat today?
Almost all of them.
I know. So, just why do you think, for instance, the swine, the pig, why do you think I know it tells us why they couldn't eat it, but why do you think we can eat it today?
Because this was the Old Testament and the old laws.
Right.
We are no longer under those old laws.
Right. And they were much stricter then as far as what they could eat and what they couldn't eat.
There still are religions today.
What's that?
There's still religions today that practice, they don't eat
Cultures.
ham or different cultures.
Oh yeah, I have some Jewish friends. In fact, my son-in-law is Jewish, and he won't eat ham and stuff. I don't know about other stuff, but I know he won't eat ham. Like when you have ham for dinner, he won't eat that. And so, like you said, there's other religions that practice the same thing. But the Bible doesn't say we should practice that. Any other questions or comments? Thank you again for reading that. Okay. B3. God did not want his people to practice idolatry or to associate with people who did. The Babylonian food would have been offered to pagan gods and would have been served to pagan feasts. To eat under those conditions would have been to wholeheartedly accept the false Babylonian gods. So that's why God didn't want them to eat it. In his book, Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization, A. Leo Oppenheim tells us about the care and feeding of the gods of Babylon. We learn in his book that some sumptuous food would be offered to the gods, and after the meal, whatever was left would be brought to the king's table as the royal food. God will still be warning about this when we get to the last book of the Bible. Someone turn to Revelations 2 and 14.
But I have a few things against thee, because thou hast there them that hold the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to cast a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed unto idols, and to commit fornication.
Okay? But what if they just ate it and didn't believe? Would that have been all right? No. God does not need secret agents. Remember Aesop's fables about the bat? The beast and the birds had a war, and the bat joined both sides. With the birds he acted like a bird, and with the beast he acted like a beast. When he was discovered, he had to hide and only come out at night. I fear that some of us may be spiritual bats. Daniel was not. Daniel made a resolution and he stuck to it. Was this difficult or easy? I think it was difficult for him to stick to it. When evidently we just read that Daniel and his 3 friends are the only one that obeyed God of what information is given to us. Go ahead, Harvey.
You were talking about the unkosher meat and food and stuff like that earlier.
Uh-huh.
For the New Testament, we have scripture, Colossians 2 and 16,
I'll read that for us.
which says, let no one judge you in food or in drink, or regard as festival or
Very good.
Everything there,
Yes.
of the Sabbath, which, verse 17 says, which are a shadow of things to come. Talk about the future shadow of things to come, but the substances of Christ.
Correct.
The
Correct.
law of Christ. What Christ is, the gospel. So getting away from the.
Getting away from the old law, we're under the new law. Correct. Daniel made a revolution stuck to it. Put yourself in his place. He had been dragged away from his home, and eventually his home had been destroyed. It seemed like God had forsaken him. He had been without much food for a long time during this siege. Maybe God wanted him to eat this food. Who would know? And what would it hurt? Wouldn't this little quibble about food hurt his chances to get a good position in the government? Wouldn't it hurt his career? Wasn't money involved? And wouldn't that overrule all other considerations? But Daniel knew what was right. And he did what was right, no matter what or who stood against him. We need more Daniels in this world. These 4 teenage boys were not the first to be tempted with forbidden fruit. But unlike Adam and Eve, they passed the test. They did not partake. Verse 8 begins with a startling statement. But Daniel purposed in his heart. Where have we heard that before? The New Testament is supposed to purpose in our heart when we give back to the Lord. Why was it startling? Because Daniel was a teenager. Because Daniel was far from home. Because Daniel had been dragged away from his family. Because many of his friends likely were telling him that God had forsaken them. Just like we read in Job. Everybody, all Job's friends were telling him that they had forsaken him. God had forsaken him. Because of the tremendous presence he was under, pressure he was under from his new observers, and he could go on and on. Any questions, comment up to this point?
You can compare all this to Job.
Yes.
You know, Job got everything taken away from him, but he didn't once forsake God.
Did not once. All his friends told him, well, God has forsaken you. But Job was trustworthy. He didn't forsake God at least. Even when he was under the pressure of his friends, of his sores on himself, he did not give up God.
Even his wife wanted him to turn him.
That's right.
God and die.
Why don't you turn away from God? But he never did.
You must have been really bad these days.
Pardon, Mike?
Job, he would reward him in the end.
Yes.
But he
And
that was, that makes you think.
I mean, Job had great wealth.
Yeah.
His family was taken away from him. All his livestock, all his wealth was taken away from him. But did he forsake God? No.
Like what they double ladder. Yeah.
Yep. Exactly.
A lot of comparisons here.
Yep. Daniel was in the same boat. But wasn't Daniel being a legalist? Wasn't he carrying the disobedience thing just a bit too far? First, we have to define what we mean by legalist. If we mean someone who focuses on part of the law while ignoring the remainder, then no. Daniel was not that. If we mean someone who obeys the law thinking that God will then owe him something, no. Daniel was not that. If we mean someone who creates new laws not in God's word and then binds men to follow them, then no. Daniel was not that. But if we mean someone who loves and delights in the law of God and who tries faithfully to follow it, all to please God and show his love for God, then yes, Daniel was a legalist in that aspect. And we should also be the same. But wasn't Daniel in the minority? Weren't all of the public opinion polls against him on this food issue? First, God's people have been in the majority only twice in the human history. Just after creation and just after the flood. At all other times they have been outnumbered by the ungodly. Our eternal destiny does not depend on the popular vote. Second, although it may come as a surprise to some, particularly in the denominational world, the church is not a democracy. We don't determine the truth. We do not vote on the truth. The truth is the truth regardless of what we think about it. Romans 3 and 4. Romans 3 verse 4. Someone read that for us.
God forbid, yea, let God be true, but every man is a liar, as it is written, that thou mightest be justified in thy sayings, and mightest overcome when thou art judged.
Because what are we going to be judged on in the end? On the truth and the Word of God. The Bible's our guidebook. If we don't obey it, we will face consequences in the end. Daniel used the word defile in verse 8. Even that word choice, was courageous. He used a strong word, but an appropriate word. The Bible names names and uses strong, direct, unmistakable language, when indeed, God is not the author of confusion. And the best way to avoid confusion is to speak plainly. Daniel did just that in verse 8. Any questions, comments? The Babylonians could change many things about Daniel's life. His homeland, his culture, his name, but they could not change his heart. He remained loyal and true to God, and he wanted to make sure the entire world knew that he was loyal and true to God. It reminds me of one of my favorite songs, "To Christ be loyal and be true. He needs brave volunteers to stand against the powers of sin, moved not by frowns or fears." Can you imagine the kind of courage required for this exiled teenager to stand up against all of the might and power of Babylon? Can you imagine the courage it took him to stand up against the peer pressure from our fellow exiles? Must have been extreme pressure for Daniel and his friends. By choosing this course of action, Daniel and his three friends were setting themselves apart from all of the others. That's what we're supposed to do as Christians, set ourselves apart from everyone else that aren't believers. The others likely thought no one would ever know what they were doing in Babylon, but Daniel knew what God would know. The others may have even blamed God for their predicament, but Daniel knew that their nation's own disobedience was to blame. Daniel faced the same sort of pressures that we face today in this world. He was pressured to change his whole way of thinking. We can only imagine the pressure and influence these pagan Babylonian teachers tried to exert on the exiles. They no doubt looked down on them as uneducated hicks who need to be taught the true way of viewing the world. The Babylonians wanted the exiles to adopt their worldview, their view of man, their view of God, their view of morality, all of which ran directly counter to what these teenagers had been taught by their parents. Parents are great influence. They can be good influence, they can be bad influences. Young people today do not face such pressures from ancient Babylon. But don't they face the same pressures from modern Babylons? Don't they face these same pressures at universities? Don't we all face these same pressures daily from our society, constant attempts to change our thinking? It's all around us. One pressure that was applied to Daniel and his friends was the pressure to participate in the occult practices of the Babylonians. Such practices are called the New Age today, although they are hardly new. The Chaldeans were so associated with magic and divination that the terms Chaldean came to mean, and it was already at this time sometimes being used to mean one who was a magician or a diviner or an astrologer. When the magicians tried to influence Daniel, he likely thought of Isaiah 8:19 and 20, which says, someone read that, and that's when we'll close our class tonight. Isaiah 8:19 and 20.
And when they shall say unto you, seek unto them that have familiar spirits, and unto wizards that peep and that mutter, should not a people seek unto their God, for the living, to the dead, to the law, and to the testimony? If they speak not according to this word, it is because there is no light in them.
Okay, that'll be our close tonight. Next week we'll get into when Mars, Earth, and Sun aligned and how often does it happen. And we'll finish up Daniel. Hopefully Daniel 1. Thank you for your attention. Any questions, comments before we got a couple minutes? Thank you for your attention.